Of course, the question of Scottish independence will ultimately be a matter for the people of Scotland, but I want to make some points, if I may, from a Welsh perspective. First of all, I've made it consistently clear that my hope is that the Scots will vote for Scotland to remain within the Union. I hold firmly to that view, and I'd like, at an appropriate time, to make that case in Scotland in support of the Better Together campaign. I want to argue that Scotland's legitimate national aspirations, like those of Wales, can be satisfied within a flexible framework of devolution within the United Kingdom. But my ability to make that case will depend entirely on the UK government's response to the first Silk report on devolution of taxation and borrowing powers. The strongest argument that can be put in favour of the Union in Scotland is that devolution works. The strongest evidence of that in Wales would be for Part 1 of the Silk Commission to be implemented. If it is not, then it will be very difficult for me to go to Scotland and say devolution is working in Wales, because what we would see is obstruction from the UK government. Now, I know that there is a lot of interest in the progress of the Silk discussions, and I've seen plenty of media speculation about what might be holding up the UK government's response to the Commission's report. I have no reason to disagree with what the Deputy Prime Minister said yesterday. As far as we're concerned, our position is crystal clear. We want progress now. We're seeking full implementation of the Silk proposals in their entirety. That means borrowing powers to support investment, full devolution of smaller taxes, including stamp duty, which is absolutely crucial to the implementation of Silk Part 1, and legislating for income tax devolution, with powers to enable a future Assembly to call a referendum on whether that should be implemented, although my view certainly at the moment is that income tax devolution is not something we should pursue. One of the main reasons, of course, it would simply lock in the underfunding that we already receive through Barnett. There would have to be a very firm financial basis for the devolution of income tax that is not in place at this moment in time. So if there's any standoff taking place, and I've read the reports in the media, it's not between us and the UK government. We know what we would like to see. That standoff is taking place within the UK government, and we saw that confirmed yesterday. We're fully committed to the whole Silk package. I do hope, however, that we will secure an ambitious response to Silk. We've been told many times by the UK government that we need to take more responsibility for our financial affairs. They cannot on the one hand say that and then on the other hand deny it to us in terms of giving us those powers, and that is very much something I'd urge them to bear in mind. We've got broad cross-party support here in Wales in favour of implementation, and I know that many business organisations are also keen that we gain powers in areas such as borrowing and stamp duty so that we can boost the economic recovery, and I believe that in the end the arguments for reform are too powerful to ignore. Someone's turned the lights on. I can finally see my notes without straining my eyes. There we are. Most recently, we've worked with the UK government on the Treasury's consultation on stamp duty devolution. Now, we've already run a consultation on this. There is strong support for the devolution of stamp duty amongst the construction industry in Wales, and I certainly hope that the UK government takes a very strong note of that. It is said that there is a potential for cross-border risks to business. The argument is put that there should not be a difference between Wales and England. Scotland's a different category, apparently, but not between Wales and England. That is an argument not against the devolution of stamp duty, that is an argument against devolution, full stop. And that is an argument that I do not accept in any way, shape or form. I have to say that the alleged risks in terms of cross-border issues seem to appear greater in Gwydir House than they are amongst businesses in the real world. But we do take our responsibilities as a government seriously. We want to move the agenda forward on the basis of consensus, and we'll continue to act as constructive partners of the UK government as it puts the finishing touches to the Silk response. We expect that good faith to be repaid. If we are to secure legislation on Silk in the lifetime of the current Parliament, and the UK government will have to keep its latest deadline and make a definitive announcement on Silk Part 1 this autumn. I hope that that is autumn in the generally accepted sense of the word, Certainly, we know the autumn extends to the winter solstice on the 21st of December, but I hope we get a response before then. We know, for example, that spring was very much elongated this year in terms of the UK government's timetable. I want to be able to go to Scotland and say, look, devolution can develop to meet changing circumstances and new aspirations. It can work that way in Scotland too. But I need the evidence to do that. That evidence has not been forthcoming from the UK government. So let's see how the UK government responds to the Silk report. Because if the response is inadequate, that will be noticed in Scotland as well as in Wales. And I want to be able to make that convincing case for devolution. In order to do that, we need to see a full response and a timely and adequate response from the UK government. The second point I want to make is rather different. It's clear that whatever the outcome of the referendum, a process of discussion and negotiation will follow, bound to happen. If the vote is for independence, which I would very much regret, the negotiation will be about the terms of Scotland's departure from the Union, as happened in the early 20s with regard to what became the Irish Free State. And new relationships will need to develop within the remaining UK. If the Scots vote to stay within the Union, then that negotiation will be about the terms of its continuing membership. But the discussion cannot be solely about Scotland. The discussion has to be about the UK as a whole, and the voice of Wales needs to be heard in those negotiations. If a new relationship is to be negotiated between an independent Scotland and the remaining UK, then all parts of the remaining UK should be able to contribute to the discussion. We all have our respective responsibilities for public services which will be affected. For example, Scottish citizens' access to the health service in Wales will need to be considered and vice versa. So we must have a seat at those discussions, whatever their exact character. Let me turn now to the issue of the Union. I am somebody, of course, who is in favour of the Union because I believe we all achieve more through our common endeavours as the UK than we could as separate nations. But the Union needs reform. It cannot carry on with a constitution that is effectively hundreds of years old in the 21st century. So let me say something about the future Union. And let us say that the Scots will vote to stay with us. Now, over the last 15 years, we've seen repeated ad hoc tinkering with the Constitution. I want this to stop. I agree very much with what Jim Gallagher said in a recent Scotsman article. He said that we need now to make devolution less of a process and more of an event. Once the referendum is out of the way, I want to see reforms which complement one another, reforms which, viewed together, create the coherent constitution which the UK currently lacks. And if that constitution can be codified, so much the better. It's true to say that the UK has a history of taking a pragmatic approach to problems and issues, allowing us in effect to experiment and develop strong institutions by seeing what works and what doesn't work, and looking at what works and what does not. Through that, we can see that the current devolution settlement for Wales is ripe for reform. Why? Any devolution settlement that sees the referral of two government bills in the early days of that settlement to the Supreme Court is inherently unstable. It's as simple as that. We've recently had our second referral of Assembly legislation to the Supreme Court in 2 years. That's not a good way to work. It's not a viable way to work, having to repeatedly test the settlement in court. Much better to have something laid out clearly at the very beginning. There has to be something fundamentally wrong when two acts of the Assembly in as many years are referred to the Supreme Court by the UK government. Neither Scotland nor Northern Ireland have had any such government referrals. Their settlements, based on the reserved powers model, have stood the test of time. The logic must be to apply those same underpinning principles to Wales. It is in no one's interest for there to be needless friction between governments within the UK, and the current devolution settlement leads to needless friction, something we could all do without. Now, it's true to say, of course, that the different nations within the UK have different histories. And I've spoken previously in support of that catchy phrase, that is rarely forgotten, of course, amongst the public, and that phrase is asymmetric quasi-federalism. I often get that on the doorstep in Bridgend. But in an equitable UK, there have to be common fundamental principles underpinning devolution. So I want to see a new constitution for the UK. And I think it should include 3 key principles for devolution across the Union. First of all, respect for the devolved legislatures. Secondly, parity of structure. And thirdly, there should be a presumption in favour of devolution of legislative and executive competence where this is practicable. Let's go into some more detail on that. First point, respect for the devolved legislatures. I mean their essential sovereignty. Big word, that sovereignty. We know in constitutional law that carries a particular meaning. What do I mean by that? I mean that they should have their right to exist guaranteed in the Constitution. The National Assembly should not have to depend on for its very existence on the goodwill of Westminster. The same is true of other devolved legislatures. No proper Parliament or Assembly should have to rely on the good faith of another for its very existence. The fact that a legislature has been established with popular support makes the point even more compelling. It cannot be right either in the 21st century that the Secretary of State retains the power of veto over Assembly legislation. That is not an appropriate power. It cannot be right that somebody appointed in London can effectively overrule a democratically elected Assembly in Wales. So a new constitution should guarantee the continuing existence of all of the devolved legislatures as permanent features of the Union, unless those legislatures, of course, agree to dissolve themselves. So I agree with those in Scotland who have been making that case in respect of the Scottish Parliament, and I want to extend that principle to the other devolved legislatures. It wouldn't be sensible or equitable, of course, if the Scots were told, yes, of course, your Parliament cannot be dissolved by Westminster, but the Assembly in Wales can. That clearly wouldn't be right. The second point, asymmetrical devolution. Yes, asymmetrical devolution can mean that different institutions have different powers. That's the case now, and it will remain the case in the future. But that doesn't mean there should be different structures for the devolution of powers. There is no logic in having different statutory measures and methods for devolving legislative competence to Wales and Scotland. A reserved powers model in Wales would not only benefit the people of Wales, it would benefit the Union as well. It would help make clear to everyone who is responsible for what. Not clear at the moment. It will make clear what responsibilities Westminster has in relation to the devolved administrations. In essence, the powers of each devolved legislature should be defined by what it cannot do, rather than, as is currently the case in Wales, of what it is graciously permitted to do. So we need the same basic method of devolving powers across the UK. Specifically, what should be reserved will vary depending on circumstances and history, but the structure and underlying principles should be consistent. That's both pragmatic and principles. We can tailor the powers for each nation and keep fundamental equality in the system. My final fundamental principle is a presumption in favour of devolution. I firmly believe that where it makes sense to take a decision in Wales, it should be taken in Wales. Some of you will remember the phrase we used in the referendum in 2011, which was that decisions that only affect Wales should be made in Wales. That word only is important, of course, but only affect Wales should be made in Wales. Unless there's a wider UK interest at stake, it's difficult to see why this should be in any way controversial. This, of course, applies equally in Scotland and Northern Ireland too, and indeed to England, were it to choose to follow the same devolutionary path. In the Imperial Tobacco case, the Supreme Court Judge Lord Hope, a Scottish judge, said that matters in which the UK as a whole has an interest should continue to be the responsibility of the UK Parliament at Westminster. I agree. The flip side of the coin, of course, is that matters in which there is no essential UK-wide interest are potentially suitable for devolution. The point of devolving more powers to Wales is to strengthen the accountability of the Assembly and to make it possible for the Welsh Government to take action in line with the priorities of the people of Wales. Public opinion is on our side in taking this forward, as the recent opinion poll evidence published by the Silk Commission reveals, and that evidence corroborates the opinion polls that we've seen in previous months. I believe I'm just reflecting Welsh public opinion when I call for more powers to be devolved to the National Assembly. Now, some will raise the spectre, as I've mentioned earlier, of cross-border issues as a reason to roll back or halt devolution. Well, it's true to say that we share populous border regions with England, but that's no reason to prevent or slow down devolution. It's normal across Europe, of course, for millions of people to live contentedly in border regions without undue difficulties. Indeed, people in the UK do it. Those of you who are familiar with the border between the UK and the Republic of Ireland will know that that border has no physical existence. That border runs through settlements, runs through fields, runs through villages, and people are used to it. It does not create an enormous problem. Why should the border between England and Wales be different? It's the same, of course, in many other countries in Europe, where, of course, there are people, thousands of people, sometimes millions of people, who live close to a border. It is not a good argument to say that cross-border issues should be an excuse for delaying or reversing, which is something that's put forward, devolution. It's perfectly manageable with goodwill and good sense on both sides. We do it already, particularly with regard to health, and it does not create an enormous problem. Now, I've not much mentioned England, of course. Far be it from me to lecture on the suitable governance arrangements there. We look forward, of course, to the UK government's response to the Mackay Commission's report. But I emphasise that any changes in the way UK or England and Wales legislation is handled will affect Wales. And I repeat that our voice should be heard. That's why the issues addressed by Mackay should be included in the wider constitutional convention that I have called for now for some months. In conclusion then, we have to take a long-term perspective. Over the centuries, the UK has had its ups and downs, but it seems clear enough to me that this small windswept land on the Atlantic's edge has achieved much more through the coming together of our four nations than we could ever have done as separate parts. I'm both pro-union and pro-devolution. I see absolutely no contradiction between the two positions. I believe devolution allows for different and distinct policy decisions to be taken with the consent of the people while still retaining the key benefits of the union. But I go further than that. I believe that being pro-devolution is an essential part of a modern pro-union philosophy. Devolution is a fact of life in the UK. It enjoys broad public support, as shown in the outcome of the 2011 referendum. It's consistently confirmed in opinion poll evidence, and it's clear that there is an appetite to go further. So a mindset of endlessly drawing lines in the sand, resisting every proposal for further devolution, no matter how reasonable or uncontroversial, is doomed to fail. Worse, hostility to reform ultimately strengthens those who argue that the UK is incapable of change. It pushes people towards a polarising choice between an unreformed status quo and independence. That is a false choice. The danger has always been that some in Whitehall and some in Westminster who would defend the union may unwittingly and uncomprehendingly preside over its dissolution. The flexibility of the UK, its ability to devolve power, has been a hallmark of strength. It is what has helped to keep the UK together. Witness the difference, for example, in terms of what has happened in Scotland with a referendum there and what is currently happening in Catalonia. I would argue that the flexibility displayed within the UK in saying to the people of Scotland, if you want a referendum, you can have a referendum, has taken a lot of the sting out of the drive towards independence in Scotland. We'll wait and see, but that certainly seems to be a factor. Denying people something that they want, in other words, denying people the opportunity to vote on something, can only make things worse. And certainly it's the case in terms of Scotland that the fact that there is a referendum has certainly enabled people to express their view on whether there should be independence or not. If we're going to secure Scotland's position in the Union, we need to have a credible and lasting commitment to devolution in the UK. This has to be a commitment which transcends the varying short-term fortunes of political parties. In many ways, the argument shouldn't be between political parties about what powers the Assembly should have, but how those powers should be implemented and used. That's what political debate is all about. And there is a general consensus. It's not a complete consensus, but a general consensus in terms of the way forward as far as devolution is concerned. I want to be able to go to Scotland and say there is a true commitment to devolution set out as a key plank of the British Constitution. That would present a real and positive alternative to the agenda of independence. And a codified constitution incorporating these principles would perhaps enable us to then describe devolution as an achievement, as an event, not an uncertain process. One of the questions I'm asked is, if devolution is a process, where does it end? I have an idea where it ends. It doesn't end at independence for me. Others will have a different view, of course. But there has to be an event which says, this is what devolution is like, this is how it's going to be for a lasting period in the future. It will provide clarity, it will provide the right level of powers, the right balance of powers between the devolved legislatures and the UK. We are not in that position now. And until we get to that position, it is inevitable that there will be friction between different legislatures and governments. It is inevitable there will be a great deal of fraying around the edges, particularly with regard to the Welsh settlement. So I say to the UK government, let's put away the scattergun approach and let's move towards a binding, durable settlement based on agreed principles. I hope today will be a stimulating and interesting and productive series of discussions for you. It's certainly been my pleasure to be able to open the event today. I hope I've given you some idea of my thinking, not that I've been particularly shy about saying it in the months gone by. And certainly I hope it'll stimulate debate as to what is Wales's position within the UK, what is the right devolution settlement for Wales, and indeed, what is the right settlement in terms of clarity and in terms of stability for the UK as a whole. Diolch yn fawr.